Hong Kong has been a special administrative region of the People's Republic of China since 1997, which means, much like an independent country, it has its own laws, its own embassies, and its own money. But a growing number of Hong Kongers want to ditch this and become an actual independent country. Why? Here's the story. Hong Kong became a British colony in the 1800s, and in 1942 was included on the UN's list of non-self-governing territories. This meant it was eligible to eventually seek independence, just like every other colony in the world. But in 1972, at the insistence of China, Hong Kong was removed from this list. Later that decade, Britain began negotiating with China about Hong Kong's future, and proposed three-way talks, which would include the people of Hong Kong. China refused, and Hong Kongers were excluded. What would Hong Kongers have wanted if anyone had asked? Probably not independence. A 1982 survey found that 85% of Hong Kongers actually wanted British rule to continue, while support for Chinese rule was only 4%. Ignoring the will of the people, Britain agreed to give China all of Hong Kong, and China agreed to let Hong Kong have its own distinct laws and democratic government, promising that these could be separate from the rest of China for 50 years, a policy known as one country, two systems. On July 1st, 1997, Britain left and China took over. I was there to see it happen, actually. I spent 3 months in Hong Kong that summer, during which time I had a very brief film career. Here's me playing a nasty Westerner, symbolically oppressing a Chinese character, before, of course, I have the stuffing beaten out of me. So, about that democratic government that China promised the people of Hong Kong, that hasn't really happened. When China took over, only half of the LegCo, Hong Kong's quasi-parliament, was directly elected by the people. The rest were elected from professional groups who have consistently chosen pro-China representatives. Hong Kong's chief executive, which is the actual title, it's not president or anything, has always been appointed by the Chinese government. According to the basic law, Hong Kong's constitution, the chief executive and all members of the LegCo are meant to eventually be elected by universal suffrage, but progress on this was really slow. So slow that Hong Kongers grew increasingly suspicious of their benevolent Chinese overlords. In 2014, a new law was introduced to finally allow democratic elections of the chief executive, but only candidates approved by China could run. This proposal was met with massive protests by tens of thousands of Hong Kongers who occupied enormous sections of the city for 79 days. When police began spraying crowds with pepper gas, protesters opened umbrellas, making umbrellas themselves a symbol of defiance. Hong Kong's ranking in the annual Democracy Index has continued to slide, especially after Chief Executive Carrie Lam proposed a new law in 2019, which would allow Chinese authorities to extradite Hong Kongers whenever they liked. This sparked the biggest demonstrations yet. That July, protesters stormed the LegCo building, and although she condemned the violence, Lam announced that the extradition bill was dead shortly after. The protests continued, and at local district elections held in November, a record turnout handed pro-China candidates their biggest defeat in Hong Kong's history. The pandemic and China's zero-COVID policies eventually brought these latest protests to an end, and Chinese authorities revamped the LegCo to ensure they had total control. The number of seats was expanded to 90, with 40 of these now appointed by a Chinese control committee. Democratically elected seats have been reduced to 20. Pro-democracy activists are also banned from running, and many have been imprisoned, like Edward Leung of Hong Kong Indigenous, or forced into exile, like Bajio Leung of Youngspiration. As trust in China's promises to Hong Kong has faded, an increasing number of Hong Kongers have called for a return to British rule, or even outright independence. Both movements regularly use Hong Kong's colonial-era flag to symbolize their fight for self-determination. Recent polls have shown that current support for independence sits at around 20%, which sounds low until you realize that this is much higher than it was before Chinese rule began. And this is despite a new security law passed in 2020, which makes advocating independence for Hong Kong strictly illegal. In July 2022, Bajio Leung and other exiled leaders announced the creation of the Hong Kong Parliament Electoral Organizing Committee, which hopes to hold elections in 2023. According to a statement, Hong Kongers should have the right to decide Hong Kong's future. Will this lead to an internationally recognized Hong Kong government in exile? We will have to wait and see. Is it even practical for Hong Kong to consider independence? China has a massive military, and Hong Kong is heavily reliant on China for water and electricity. It's hard to see how it could survive with a hostile regime just over the border. And yet, Hong Kong is culturally very different from China, and Hong Kongers have a distinct political identity. If China cannot respect its one country, two systems principle, more and more Hong Kongers will yearn for two systems in two countries.